much for being here. We're blessed to have you here, and I hope that you being here turns out to be a blessing, and I expect that it will. We want to, first of all, we want to tell you a little bit about how this came to be. And just a very brief, we have a young lady here who is a sophomore student at Unity Christian School, and she is a member, as a matter of fact, the founding chairman of Young Americans for Freedom at Unity Christian, that chapter. Hannah Payne, a year or so ago, I guess, went to a conference, and at this conference of YAF, and at this conference, Reverend Cruz spoke, and she was in awe of that, and came back home, as I understand from her mother, saying, "We've got to have him in Rome, Georgia." And she set about working, along, by the way, with her other YAF associates and members. She set about working to bring him here. Somewhere along the way, we got a call. She put it together with Pleasant Valley South. She put it together with Unity Christian, and she put it together with the Rome Tea Party. And that's a magnificent accomplishment for a young lady, sophomore in high school. And so we are most appreciative of her, and we are most appreciative of Young Americans for Freedom. So Hannah, could you come here for a moment? And on behalf, Hannah, of the Rome Tea Party, we have a donation to Young Americans for Freedom, and hope that helps you along the way. Okay, thank you. By the way, Diane, where'd you go? Could you come up here? We just want you to sit here in case you're called on for to tell everybody what your last name is. I don't know how many of you listen to Tea Party talk, but if you do, you're totally confused as to Diane's name. Okay. Today, we are truly honored to have a gentleman here who has found and lived the American dream, who found his way out of the tyranny of Batista in Cuba, who found his way to Texas, where he got a job and worked his way through the University of Texas, while at the same time learning English. And then he became involved in politics and so forth through the 1980 campaign of Ronald Reagan. So when Diane and I read that, we said, hey, this is our man here. And he certainly is. He is, of course, a pastor. He is a professor. He is the father of United States Senator Ted Cruz and candidate for president Ted Cruz. So Reverend Cruz's story is not for me to tell, but for him to tell. So if you will join me in welcoming Reverend Rafael Cruz.
Well, it is such a blessing to be not only in Rome, Georgia, and to be at a Tea Party meeting, but to be in a Messianic congregation. You know, when I was teaching in a Bible school, I taught the Torah twice. And I too go to the biblical Hebrew roots to find out what the Bible is all about. And you realize that America is founded on Judeo-Christian ethics, Judeo-Christian values, and we both serve the same Yahweh. And so we are one and the same. And as a matter of fact, in the book of Ephesians, chapter 2, it talks about breaking down the wall of partition between Jew and Gentile and make us all one in Yeshua. And so I'm so glad to be here where that is the purpose is of this Messianic congregation, is to make both Jew and Gentile one in Yeshua. I'm also so honored and privileged to be at a Tea Party. You know, it was the Tea Party that elected my son to the U.S. Senate. Let me tell you, when my son was elected, the headlines across the nation called it the biggest upset of the year. Ted was running against one of the wealthiest men in Texas, a man with $250 million in the bank, who spent $35 million in attack ads. The whole political establishment in Austin and in Washington was against him. $35 million of attack ads, 22 million of that came from this man's own pockets. Bunch of lies. They called Ted a red Chinese communist, and that was actually the mildest of the attacks against him. But you know, the Tea Party rallied around Ted all across the state of all across the nation, actually. And they were all shoulder to shoulder. The opposition had $35 million of attack ads, but Ted had tens of thousands of volunteers walking the neighborhoods, knocking on doors, and actually, you know what? The power of the grassroots is a lot bigger than the power of the money. We just read today about a new candidate that says that he's going to spend over $2 billion in the next election. But you know, we the people are more powerful than any amount of money in the world. So I want to share with you, first of all, I want to talk a little bit about my story. As you heard a minute ago, I was born in Cuba. You can probably tell that by my Bostonian accent. I was born in Cuba and grew up under a very oppressive military dictatorship. And the revolution started in the high schools and the universities. It first started with student protests, which were quickly met with billy clubs. As a matter of fact, during those times, it was a badge of honor to have a patch on your head or you got hit by a billy club. And I remember during those times, a young, charismatic leader rose up, talking about hope and change. His name was Fidel Castro. And we all followed him. We thought he was going to be our liberator. Little did we know. Well, anyway, as a result of that, I got involved in the revolution, was captured, was imprisoned, was tortured. But by the grace of God, I was able to leave Cuba legally on a student visa. I came to the United States on a student visa, didn't have practically any money, couldn't speak a word of English. Got to the University of Texas, got a job as a dishwasher for one simple reason. You don't have to talk to anybody to wash dishes. You're locked up out there in the kitchen, they bring you the dishes, you wash them, you get paid. And in addition to that, at that time, you got all your food for free. So I would eat enough in my 8 hours of work so I wouldn't be hungry the other 16 because I didn't have any money to buy food. I went to school full-time, worked full-time. That's why I have no sympathy whatsoever For young kids coming to me and saying, I can't go to college, my parents don't have any money. Go to work! You know, when my son was graduating from high school, I went broke. I was in the oil business, and my company went bankrupt. And my son wanted to go to Princeton. And I said, Dad, I don't have any money. He said, don't worry, Dad. I'll get a job. He did better than that. He got 2 jobs. And he paid himself the way to Princeton. So, you know, if you have the desire, you can do it. Yes. That's the greatness of America. You know, I came to Texas late 1957 when I left Cuba, still thinking that Castro was going to be our liberator. Castro took over in 1959, and at the end of May of 1959, I went back to Cuba. And I got the shock of my life. That same man who had been talking about hope and change was now talking about how the rich were evil, how they oppressed the poor, and about the need to redistribute the wealth. They began confiscating private property. They began, even to them, the rich was anybody who even was a professional. So if you were a medical doctor or an engineer, you were the rich. And they would confiscate your home. Then they began attacking freedom of the press and shutting down newspapers and television stations and putting journalists in jail. Then they began attacking freedom of religion. Let me give you an idea. Soldiers would come into a kindergarten class and would tell the kids, all right, kids, close your eyes and pray to God for candy. Come on, close your eyes and pray to God for candy. Where's the candy? No candy. All right, close your eyes again and pray to Fidel for candy. And while the kids had their eyes closed, very quietly, those soldiers would place candy on all the desks. You know, as we look around today, there is a lot of religious persecution in America. But we need to understand one thing. Religious persecution is not the objective. It is only the means to another objective. You see, Marxism, socialism, communism, whatever you want to call it, it's all the same. Requires that government becomes your God. And in order to make government your God, you must destroy the concept of God. That is what's behind all the attack on religion that we see in America today. Is that they want you to make almighty government your God. Anyway, I left Cuba disillusioned, never to return again, but so happy and so grateful to be in the land of the free and the home of the brave. I am so proud to be an American. This is without a doubt the greatest country on the face of the earth, and don't let anybody tell you otherwise. You know, our president has been going around telling people that this is not an exceptional country, going around the world apologizing to our enemies about America, trying to make us a third world country. But this is indeed an exceptional country. Do you realize that America is the only country on the face of the earth that was founded on the Word of God? Was founded by men and women seeking the freedom to worship God. As a matter of fact, do you realize that those pilgrims that came to America, the reason they came is if you were in England at the time of King James, at the beginning of the 16th century, and you were not a member of the Church of England, you were a heretic and you were persecuted. So these pilgrims come to America seeking that freedom to worship Almighty God. They landed in Plymouth, Massachusetts. And their first year there, they decided to try a communist experiment. They basically said, we have all this land before us. Let us all work this land together. And we will share equally in what the land produces. Sounds so romantic, doesn't it? Well, that experiment was a total failure. They almost starved to death. Because what happened was this. Perhaps the strong one could plow 2 acres of land, while the weak one could plow 1/4 of an acre. How long do you think it took for that strong one to say, I ain't doing any more than got that guy over there? So nobody worked. Equality of outcome has never worked. So they almost starved. But they were smart enough and flexible enough that the second year they came before Governor Bradford and they said, this didn't work. And Governor Bradford said, all right, each of you take your own plot of land, you work the land, you feed the family. And the free enterprise system was born in America the second year they were in Plymouth. Now the question is this, if we tried it 400 years ago and it didn't work, why would we be dumb enough to try it again? That doesn't make any sense at all. But that's exactly what we're living on today. Well, you know, as a result of what I saw when I came back from Cuba, I was so grateful to be in this wonderful country, and I decided that I would make the best of it. That I too would achieve the American dream. I worked full-time, went to school full-time, worked 8 hours a day, never took less than 17 hours a semester, graduated in 3.5 years, then taught mathematics at the University of Texas while I went to grad school. 6 years after leaving college, I had my own business in oil and gas exploration. And then in the late 70s, I was shocked again. Some of you may remember the Carter years. 18% interest rates. 22% interest rates. 22% interest rates. Double-digit inflation, double-digit unemployment, lines around the block to get gasoline. A government so weak in foreign policy that Iran had become so emboldened that they captured 82 Americans and held them hostage for 444 days. You know, it is not coincidental that those hostages were released the day President Reagan was inaugurated, because they knew Reagan was not going to mess around with them. And you know something? Do you know who President Reagan appointed to welcome the hostages? Jimmy Carter. Isn't that poetic justice? Well, anyway, as a result of Jimmy Carter, I became very involved in an organization called the Religious Roundtable. The Religious Roundtable was a coalition of Christians and Jews that got together for one purpose: to help elect Ronald Reagan. We work in collaboration with a second organization called Moral Majority, headed by Jerry Falwell. And together we mobilize millions of people of faith to help elect whom I consider the greatest president of the last 150 years, President Ronald Reagan. I remember all through 1980, I was working very hard on the Reagan campaign. Our conversation around the dinner table was all centered on politics. My son was 9 years old. So I'll tell you, my son got a dose of conservative politics every day for a year when he was 9 years old. And I remember I must have told him a dozen times, you know, Ted, when I lost my freedom in Cuba, I had a place to come to. If we lose our freedoms here, where are we going to go? There is no place to go. And let me tell you something, America is worth saving. America is worth saving. So I was so excited when Ronald Reagan was inaugurated. You know, I'll tell you something very interesting about Ronald Reagan. There are so many parallels between that time and today. You know, there's only been 2 times in modern history where we have seen 4 years in a row with less than 1% growth. First, it was in the transition between Carter and Reagan. And the second has been during this current administration. The 5th year of Ronald Reagan, you know what the GDP was? 7.2% growth. 5th year of Ronald Reagan. 5th year of Obama was less than 1%. But it took Jimmy Carter to give us Ronald Reagan.
That's right.
Because of Jimmy Carter, we were able to mobilize millions of Americans. We did it in 1980. We can do it again. And let me tell you something. We've got a lot of things today that we didn't have in 1980. In 1980, there was no internet. There was not Facebook or Twitter. There weren't any bloggers. There weren't any conservative radio talk show hosts. There was no Tea Party in 1980.
No.
So if we did it then, you bet we can do it again. And let me tell you, if we have someone like Hillary Clinton elected in 2016, you might as well kiss this country goodbye. This country is gone. We are fighting for the survival of America. And I'll tell you what, unfortunately, the problem in Washington is not the Democrats. The problem in Washington is the establishment in both parties. In both parties. You know, these people are not concerned with your needs and mine. They're concerned with staying in power. And so, as a matter of fact, you know, and I don't intend to talk about a campaign thing for my son, but I'll tell you something. My son is not running against the Democrats. My son is running against Washington. He's running against the establishment in both parties, because the problem is with both parties. It is about time that we, the people, rise up. You know, it is something that I have such a burden in my heart for this country. I love this country. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you, a couple of years ago, I was a keynote speaker at an organization that I'm trying to get Hannah to get involved with. It's called Patriot Academy. Patriot Academy is an organization that David Barton started trying to teach young kids the Constitution and conservative government and limited government and so on and so forth. And I was their keynote speaker. And I was introduced as a Cuban American. Well, I got to the podium and I said, with all due respect, I have to correct my introduction. I do not consider myself a Cuban American. I am an American who was born in Cuba. That's a totally different thing. Just like you may be an American whose ancestors came from Ireland or Italy or Scotland, who knows where. We're all Americans. And this whole concept of hyphenated Americans has one purpose: divide and conquer. Divide and conquer. We're all Americans. And I'll tell you what, there's no time that has become more apparent than in our Revolutionary War. I tell you, I am a student of the framers. I love American history because we have such a heritage in this country. And unfortunately, our history has been erased from the history books. I remember about 2 years ago, I was at a pastor's conference in Des Moines, Iowa. my son was speaking at this conference, I heard a statistic in this conference that really blew my mind. And the statistic said that practically half of the Christians in the United States were not even registered to vote. And of the ones that were registered to vote, practically half didn't even vote in the last election. And so I came home really burdened with this. And what I felt was that if there's one group of people that can be blamed for what's happening in America today, it is the pastors. Because pastors across America, in the great majority, are hiding behind their pulpits. Scared to death of being politically incorrect. Scared to death of offending anybody. Scared to death of losing their tax exemption. Scared to death of someone leaving the congregation and consequently income leaving the congregation. And I tell these pastors, it's about time you stop being concerned about being politically correct and you become biblically correct. And I share with them about our history. You know, you look at the Declaration of Independence. What a wonderful document. Written by a man that has been so maligned and called a deist and called the most ungodly of all the framers. But I'll tell you, if there's one message on that document that Thomas Jefferson wrote, is to exalt our Creator above all things. And I'll tell you, you look at the Declaration of Independence, and you find 17 grievances against King George. I'll tell you something that perhaps some of you may not know. Did you know that each and every one of those grievances were preached from the pulpits of America before they were written on the Declaration? It was preachers from the pulpit calling out King George for the atrocities that he was perpetrating upon the American people. Where are those pastors today? They're hiding behind their pulpits. Now there are a few that are speaking out, but it's a small minority. And you know, we have been fed a lie about the secularism of America. As a matter of fact, I want to tell you about the second so-called deist. You know who is? Benjamin Franklin, right? Those are the two that the liberals, the progressives, like to talk about. They call them the ungodly framers, the deists. Let me tell you about Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin, the Constitutional Convention had been going on for about 4 weeks. And it was falling apart. I mean, they were at each other's necks. Because every colony wanted their proposal. And after 4 weeks of this thing, Madison was ready to go home and I was falling apart. And it was Benjamin Franklin that gets up and addresses the president of the convention, none other than George Washington. And he says, "Sir, how is it that we have not once called upon the Father of lights to illuminate our understanding? Or have we forgotten when we started this struggle against Great Britain, how we met in these very chambers for prayer, seeking His protection and direction? Those prayers were graciously answered. Or do we feel that we no longer need His assistance? Sir, I have lived a long life. And the longer I live, the more assured I am of this fact, that God governs the affairs of men." That's not the statement of a deist. A deist is someone that says, God created the universe and then he said, okay, have at it. But Franklin continues, and he says, if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that we can build an empire without his aid? As the Holy Scriptures tell us, unless the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. And he said, if we proceed to build this without him, we will fare no better than the builders of Babel. And then he said, concluding, I beseech you therefore, my brethren, that from now and henceforth, before we proceed with our deliberations, we meet in these chambers every morning for prayer, seeking his wisdom and direction. They left the Constitutional Convention that day, and they all gathered at the church of Brother Pastor Witherspoon, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. They came back the next day in a totally different spirit. And a few short weeks later, they gave us the greatest document that has ever been written outside of the Bible, the Constitution of the United States of America. And you know, that document, along with the Declaration, those two documents have lasted over 2 centuries. And I believe the reason they have lasted over 2 centuries is because they were forged on the knees of the framers. Those framers were seeking revelation from above. And that's what they got. I am convinced that the Constitution of the United States is a divinely inspired document, the same as the Declaration. Let me share something with you. For millennia, the model for government has always been the same. This is a man-made model. And the model has been authority flows from God to the government to the people. I repeat, it's not God's model, it is man's model. Even in the Old Testament, if you read in 1 Samuel chapter 8, the people of Israel came to the prophet Samuel demanding, we want a king just like the other nations around them had a king. And God said to Samuel, Samuel, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. You know, before then, Israel was ruled by judges that rose up from among the people. And now the nation of Israel placed themselves under that same man-made model, which is authority flows from God to the government to the people. And throughout history, kings and tyrants have used that model to oppress the people and to justify their oppression upon the people. Their reasoning is like this: I have the right to oppress you because my authority comes from God. But you see, when those framers were on their knees